So we come to the third and last of these lectures, and I'm even more aware with respect to this one than to its predecessors of the fact that I'm going to have to summarize and go very quickly over material that is available in somewhat greater length in the full papers that I've sent along. So if you want to sort of get a little bit more detail, it's in the papers, which I think are posted on the website. So let me talk today about progressive valuation. Here we come to a part of human life that is, I think, immensely important, and as I've suggested from the beginning, a part that frames really progress in the sciences, formal and natural. And yet, it's a very messy and difficult domain. So I'm going to talk about three kinds of values. These values are values for individual people sometimes, communities, whole societies. And I think it's reasonable to believe that individuals make progress, communities make progress, and whole societies, even the whole world, makes progress with respect to values. But the kinds of values that I'll distinguish are moral values, ethical values, and what I'll call personal values. In a certain very obvious sense, I will want to think of the moral as an important part of the ethical, and the personal as what, as it were, is available to individuals, communities, and societies once, as it were, the ethical, including the moral, has constrained it. But as you'll see, I want to talk about the dynamic relations among these things. Okay, so let me begin with a preliminary geography. As I understand moral values and morality and moral progress, it's all about how to act. So moral progress consists in advances with respect to the question how to act. Ethical progress consists in advances with respect to the question how to be. And since how to be involves, as it were, knowing how to act, the ethical subsumes the moral, but I think it's very important to treat them separately for reasons that I think will come apparent in a moment. And finally, personal values enter in both contexts. They can articulate our prior perspective on moral or ethical values, or sometimes they can prompt changes of perspective, precisely because we have a personal commitment to something. Something strikes us personally. We can be led to articulate further a moral or ethical idea, and sometimes even to change our moral or ethical views. Okay, so pragmatic progress, again. Moral and ethical progress are best understood as pragmatic progress. And progress with respect to personal values is sometimes a matter of responding to local goals generated by the difficulties of the current situation. That's most obvious with respect to instrumental reasoning. There is something, of course, that I value, and I recognize that something else, it would be a means to it or a way of obtaining it, and that leads me to value the means or the intermediate step. Okay, so I'm going to have to give you a story of how you pin down the kinds of problems that are involved in moral and ethical progress, and we shall come to that. But first, as with both the two previous lectures, I'm going to want to venture into some genealogy to try to understand where these parts of human practice come from. I think valuation begins in the regimentation of our desires and impulses. That, if you like, the initial idea of something as being valuable comes from a distinction among desires, which is drawn often retrospectively after a desire has been satisfied. That some desires are, as it were, regretted and others are endorsed. That practice, I think, is extremely old, and it's observed, I think, in the Machiavellian intelligence of other animals. I mean, lots of studies of chimpanzees have shown how chimps adjust and control their behavior, not following impulses or desires that they would otherwise have followed because of the circumstances. Thus, a subordinate chimp interested in starting a liaison with one of the females in the troop will, as it were, restrain that desire if the chimp sees that the dominant animal can observe what's going on. But if the dominant animal's gaze is blocked by some obstacle, then that offers an opportunity. So there are these wonderful observations from the field of Machiavellian chimpanzees luring their would-be partners into places that are out of the view of their superiors in the group. Now, the origins of moral life, I think, come about when groups themselves engage in this practice of regimentation, when they start identifying patterns of behavior as valuable or not valuable, and introducing punishment. Punishment is very old. Punishment for the animals around who don't engage in following the valued patterns, or do engage in following the prohibited patterns. And in all of this, our human ancestors were, I think, responding to the symptoms of an underlying condition, something that is part of our evolved psychology. And that is what I call our limited responsiveness to one another. So like the chimps and the bonobos, we are able to identify the desires, plans, and intentions of our fellows, and sometimes to adjust our own desires, plans, and intentions to reach an outcome that helps them, sometimes helps us as well. And so that kind of thing I call responsiveness. It's involved in, as it were, adjusting your behavior in such a way that you respond to another member of the group. And that makes possible a form of social life that is very unusual, namely the ability to live in, not incredibly small groups that are mixed by age and sex, as we and our ancestors have done for a very long time, millions of years. But it's limited. And so chimpanzee societies are often torn by tension. They need strategies of peacemaking. They're constantly on the verge of breaking up. So we can live in these societies, but we can't do it smoothly and easily on the basis of our evolved psychology. The moral agent emerges on the scene once the group as a whole starts playing a role in the restraint of action. And the original motivation is so crude and vulgar that one wonders whether you should actually talk about a moral agent here at all. Once the group gets into the act and starts laying down the laws and the patterns of behavior and so forth, it's a matter of prudence to avoid punishment, to abide by those things. But that gets developed, and it gets developed in a number of ways which seem to be, as far as one can tell, very widely shared, if not universal. The idea of gods as guardians of morality, fantastic device for making sure that people behave when they're out of the view of their fellows. Promoting identification with the group. This is what we do. Identification with particular patterns of conduct, possibly because we have thought things through and decided on them. Of making deviations seem unthinkable. It's just not something I can even think of anymore. Socializing the young so that just becomes off the horizon, and producing a kind of sympathy for others, actually, as it were, directly expanding the responsiveness of the individual by promoting identification with the perspectives of other people. All of this builds, I think, a multi-sided set of dispositions and capacities within us, which is what we sort of vaguely refer to as a conscience. That is, to my mind, a very, very mixed and well-buffered system. It's important, this is becomes an important feature in human behavior and in human life. And because it's important, we need lots and lots and lots of ways of reinforcing it, just as normal evolution, under natural selection, typically provides many systems as backups to make sure that the important jobs get done. Now, ethical life, asking the question how to be, has to be, I think, a late emergence. It has to come after moral life has gotten going. Because in the initial situation of our ancestors, say 50,000 years ago, which is when ethical life, I think there's probably a minimum age for moral life, not for ethical life. 50,000 years ago, our ancestors struggling in relatively small bands, 40 to 70 individuals. There's no serious alternative. If you went back in a time machine and said to the individual members of the band, assuming you could talk to them, well, you know, have you thought about how to be? Have you thought about the way in which you should live? They would probably, if they were polite, give you a funny look. If they weren't so polite, they'd probably throw things at you. There are no serious alternatives. The band is typically struggling to survive, and everybody is supposed to do all sorts of jobs to keep it going, to sustain things. But there will be a variance in contributions to the group, and as that variance becomes noticeable, that will show up in retrospective verdicts on lives. And that will produce, perhaps, a moral imperative where there wasn't one before, namely the imperative to train oneself and to cultivate the self-regarding virtues so that one can do one's bit for the group. But as groups progress, the division of labor starts. That occurred already, as you may remember, in my myth of Jones. And once the division of labor has started, there will be some roles that are perhaps especially important. And those who fill those roles, and especially those who fill those roles well, may be regarded as living especially good and important lives. And so that may begin a process in which one can ask questions about what kind of person one can be. And that will be reinforced through the evolution of emotional ties and different relationships. I think there's a lot to be said about this, but along the way, between the arrival of language, the invention of morality, and the first written documents we have, I think the emotional horizons for human beings changed considerably and allowed for the evolution of new kinds of relationships. And That gives rise to a kind of variety that makes the question how to be an important one. So living well eventually seems to require, and here I'm jumping way into the sort of 18th and 19th centuries. Choosing your own life, that's something that liberals since the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century have found important, which is typically done tacitly in one's choices about what kinds of things to pursue, what kinds of values to have, and freely. With some success, your plans must not all collapse to live well, it seems, and with some sort of positive impact on something larger than yourself, the lives of others. And I think that's already in the idea of living well from its inception, because it's there already, I think, in the idea of contributions to the life of a band. So that's the way in which I think about ethical life as eventually emerging, originally through the provision of alternatives for living, and eventually for emphasizing various dimensions of living well. First of all, the autonomy dimension, choosing your own plan of life, life project, self-ideal. Secondly, the success dimension, that is, not having all your plans go awry. And finally, the idea of a contribution to something that will survive you, something bigger than yourself, a group, a band, other human lives that you care about, or something grand and transcendent, as many people would say. That's really the sort of thing. It's only through serving God that my life becomes truly meaningful. I don't think that's by any means the only way to, as it were, build out the liberal conception, but I think it is and has been one very prominent one. Okay, now all of what I've said so far seems to leave out something from ethical life, namely the role of fun, pleasant experience in it. And I want to enter the lists here against the Puritans. It seems to me that rewarding experiences ought to be a part of living well, not only because of what they do in advancing our personal goals, the goals that we set for ourselves, but also intrinsically. And I'm going to point to something that I think is often overlooked in discussions of hedonism. When we think about hedonism, we tend to think about things like the experience machine, or if you've seen Woody Allen's movie Sleeper, the orgasmatron. These are places where individuals go and they have these sort of, they're bombarded with hedonic bliss. But I think actually hedonism has its roots in something different, namely in shared joys, shared pleasures, shared avoidance of pain. And so I think in terms of the original form of ethical life, if there's something that is there that it comes before people can start making decisions about how to live, it's the idea of living together with pleasant experiences and avoiding the painful ones, preparing for shared feasts and festivals, doing things together that bring all of us joy and happiness, avoiding together things that would bring us suffering and pain. Now, let's turn to the personal side of things. I've talked somewhat about morality and ethics and their genealogy. Now I want to talk about pleasures that we regret. So after ethical and moral life have developed, we regret satisfying the desires and impulses that detract from our central goals. Certain kinds of experiences come to seem repulsive to us because we see them as blighting something that's much more important. And that can easily lead to another kind of Puritanism, the Puritanism of thinking that the kinds of lesser pleasures, the kinds of things we do to relax are somehow, if we were better people, we wouldn't do those sorts of things. But I think that's wrong. I think irrelevant occupations can sometimes not only be pleasurable in themselves, but also prepare us for the efforts that we need to achieve our goals. So we should value those kinds of pleasant experiences, which may not be, tremendously important to us, but are nonetheless very good ways of, helping us get ready for the things that we really want to do and really want to value. And those are set aside other kinds of experiences which we regard as much more significant in our lives. I'll call them fulfilling experiences. It's not that I want to downplay the minor ones, but I do want to give a special role to the ones that are, as it were, the really significant things that we sometimes hail as experiences that gave us enormous satisfaction and had a great deal of import for us. And some of these are religious, and they deepen people's commitments to religion, and they point sometimes in new directions. Think of Saul becoming Paul on the road to Damascus. But I think religious experiences are far from the only ones that do this. That aesthetic experiences, whether with respect to the natural world or whether they come from our involvement in possibly creation of, but often interaction with works of art, can have exactly the same kind of deepening and redirecting. So I think these can be immensely important. They are important in themselves, and they are important because of the roles that they play in ethical and moral life. An aesthetic experience, for example, can bring you up short, can lead you to realize that certain kinds of habits that you have fallen into in your moral life need to be changed. How many people reading a novel like Bleak House or Invisible Man have had their moral perceptions altered? Quite a lot, I think. And I think of the religious experience and the aesthetic experiences as Dewey did, as species of a single genus. It's a genus that's hard to characterize precisely, I think. But this kind of experience has and can have enormous impact. I think Wordsworth puts it extremely well in his poem on Tintern Abbey. He talks about experiences such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. That's directly speaking, I think, to the moral dimension, the dimension in which we learn how to respond better to those around us. But he says these experiences also can give us a kind of cognitive insight. When the clouds seem to part, when we seem to find ourselves in the presence of some understanding we didn't have before, that blessed mood in which the burden of this mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. And the result of that, he thinks, is we see into the life of things. And I think aesthetic experience and religious experience, and perhaps there are other kinds of fulfilling experience, play this double role. They can modify our states of responsiveness, our abilities to sympathize and empathize, and at the same time they can lead us to see things that are important that we've previously missed, and thereby either deepen our commitment to a plan of life that we've been pursuing or lead us to change direction. So, progress with respect to personal values helps us avoid regret. That is perhaps the simplest and most basic form of progress. And that's initially simple. We, like the Machiavellian chimps, regiment desires that are found to lead to unwelcome consequences. But later, it integrates our desires with our moral convictions and self-ideals, sometimes by leading to revisions. So I want to suggest that there is this dynamic between the ethical and moral on the one hand and the personal, especially in the field of these examples I've called, experiences I've called fulfilling experiences, which is a complex dynamic that doesn't necessarily go in the direction of ruling out the experience as a bad one, but rather the experience can sometimes lead us to improved moral and ethical reflections. So now, I've talked as if all of these domains can make progress, but push now has to come to shove. I have to say something about how progress goes on in moral and ethical life. And I'm going to do that by pointing to some historical paradigms of moral progress. First of all, the repudiation of chattel slavery. Second, the expansion of opportunities for women. And third, the acceptance of same-sex love. I suspect that most people who are involved with these lectures will accept these as examples of progress. But if you don't, then think of any other example you can imagine, which does seem to you clearly an example of moral progress. Perhaps, giving up on torture, or giving up on infanticide, whatever it may be. Okay, now it seems to me that one way of thinking about moral progress is to take, and this is again, I take it, a Kuhnian lesson, is to try to look at these episodes and to figure out what was going on and try to use that to understand what moral problems are and what moral progress is. So I shall start with those paradigms and with related episodes that failed. The liberation of gays and lesbians worked when, in the aftermath of the Stonewall riot, as it was called at the time. It didn't work when Oscar Wilde tried to make a case for love that dare not speak its name. So we can ask with respect to these, what is it that contributes to success and what puts the achievement at risk? An obvious common feature of these cases is that what happens at the end is the inclusion of previously excluded perspectives. That's sometimes, but not always, the inclusion of previously excluded individuals. That surely seems to have happened in the case of slavery. And that's inspired people, goes back at least to Hume, to talk of the expanding circle. But that's not an entirely felicitous way of describing the situation, I think, because typically inclusion also involves exclusion. So when you accept same-sex love, at the same time, you reject homophobia. So there's, as it were, some expansion and some contraction. And it's not always individuals, it's sometimes perspectives. After all, women weren't outside the moral sphere entirely before their opportunities were expanded. It was just that certain kinds of perspectives they could take were outside, and the same is even more clearly true of gays and lesbians. Now, William James, in a remarkable essay, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, suggests that moral philosophy has a check on it. The philosopher, he says, only knows that if he makes a bad mistake, the cries of the wounded will soon inform him of the fact. Now, in the examples I've chosen as my paradigms, the cries don't get heard. And sometimes it turns out the wounded don't even cry. And they don't even cry because they have effectively been silenced, or they have been so socialized as to absorb the perspective that is oppressing them. So we have to think, I think, in terms of two different kinds of processes that go on in these episodes. One of them is finally the voiced sufferings of people whom we later regard as oppressed come finally to be heard. And the other is that we overcome a kind of false consciousness, one kind of false consciousness, I think. Oppression and confinement that nobody has previously recognized is brought to light. So I'm going to treat these separately, beginning with the simpler one, when the sufferings of the oppressed are voiced and come to be heard. So a first step in moral methodology. I want to try to find out when a complaint is justified. I'm going to say that a moral problem arises from a complaint, but not all complaints are justified. So I need to be able to say when complaints are justified. And so to do that, I'll try to figure out a methodology for moral inquiry. The first thing to say is that moral inquiry should focus on urgent cases. It should take felt suffering seriously and use the severity that it can recognize in them to assess their urgency. So how should that be done? So I'm going to generalize something that I've said in other contexts about the organization of the sciences and about moral life. Moral disputes are, I think, to be settled through what I'll call an ideal conversation. An ideal conversation assembles representatives of all those affected by the question under discussion. It uses only the best available factual information. Most importantly, it requires all participants to listen to and to attempt to enter into the perspectives of each of the others and to adjust their own attitudes in light of doing so. Deliberators are to be mutually engaged. Why is that appropriate as a way of thinking about moral inquiry? Because it gives an ideal that enables us to diagnose features that not only show up in my paradigms. People use bad information, they're not sufficiently inclusive, they don't engage with the perspectives of one another. But it also points to what I think is the very feature that got moral life started in the first place. And it's here that my genealogy becomes very important to me. It's in this idea of coming to terms with one another's perspectives. That's what actual hunter-gatherers do when they try to figure out their moral lives, and it's what we can presume that our ancestors did when they, hunter-gatherers too, engaged in starting morality. But the reason why this is an appropriate method for moral inquiry is that it's fitted to the problem. The problem, I said at the very beginning, lay in the limits of our responsiveness. And the way to address exactly that is to become more responsive to others. That is to try to enter into the perspectives and the lives of other beings who are affected by the situation. So this is, I think, a first idea of moral methodology. It's a bit like I mean, I'm not going to claim to be Galileo or Bacon or anybody like that, but you should think of it as having the same status as the first steps of trying to figure out the methodology of the sciences. This is something that gets you started on a systematic enterprise of moral inquiry. So, the moral project, I claim, grows out of our limited capacity for responding to others. And moral method is social. We work out what to do in ideal conversation, or rather, we make moral progress by trying to improve the conversations and discussions we have in the ways marked out by the ideal I've just given you as a diagnostic tool to remedy the features to which it points. And I think of philosophical theories, the kinds of things that we have in the history of moral philosophy, as tools for use in the conversation. These aren't, as it were, the answers to moral questions, so much as ways of helping people come to terms with the situation and other people's reactions to it. They're devices for facilitating the kind of conversation that we need to have. Now, so far, I've just set up something that will respond to complaints that are already voiced. That will have to be extended if we're to take on the feature of false consciousness, which seems to show up again and again in my historical paradigms. False consciousness, one said, doesn't really exist. But apparently, there are complaints that would be justified, even though nobody makes them. Let's think about the ideal Victorian wife. Let me paint a scene for you. Husband and wife are sitting on either side of the fireside. He is reading an improving book. She is at her needlework, plying her needle. And he looks up and he says to her, "My dear, I've done my best to be a good husband, but have I made you truly happy?" And she raises her adoring eyes to him and says, "Oh yes, I couldn't be happier. This is everything that I wanted from life." Now, I think false consciousness is surely at least in the wings here, if not actually on stage and fully present. And what has caused that false consciousness is surely the absorption on her part, the complete absorption of an ideal prescribed for her by society. And that has become, so invasive that she's taken on the perspective of those whom we might see retrospectively as her oppressors. Now, so if that's right, then false consciousness has arisen in my historical paradigms because ideals that are available to some members of the society are condemned for others. And those debarred are therefore confined when they address the ethical question, when they make choices that settle what their self-identity, what their life project is to be. And their silence then expresses a moral problem. We might say that the prevailing moral practice prevents them from becoming who they are. So, I want to suggest that in addition, progress in personal values can consist in identifying experiences that deepen and elaborate an existing self-ideal or that point to a superior self-ideal, one that may be seen as closer to who you are and pursued with greater success and have greater positive impact on something beyond yourself, and that this may occur in the action of diagnosing false consciousness. So this thought of the intertwining between the personal and the, in a sense, the heart of the ethical seems to me a crucial part of understanding these episodes and understanding ethical progress. So I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts. Going back to my first two lectures, progress in the cognitive domains, the natural or the formal sciences, is subject to the requirement of enhancing human lives. And that should be understood in light of progressive practices of valuation. We should constantly be trying to make progress with the valuations and values that we have collectively and individually, and using that to frame the kinds of enterprises that go on in the cognitive or in the cognitive domains. And my final thought is to point to a limitation of what I've said. There is something that this discussion of valuation ought to bring out that renders what I have said incomplete. And that is the difficulty of trying to deal with domains individually, when the different parts of our lives and the ways in which they change and are set up interact with one another. And it's quite possible that we can seem to make progress in a particular domain from the point of view of that individual domain, say an area of science or an area of the law, or with respect to education, say. Even though if we took a larger view of the whole framework of institutions and practices and domains that permeate our lives, we would see that, in fact, there have been overall losses. That's something I call institutional friction. And that, so far, is a limitation of the account I've given you, in that it doesn't take account of that. It raises very difficult issues. Anyway, I want to say at the very end, it's been a privilege to give these lectures. They are part of work in progress. They're by no means complete. And I suspect I shall be working on these themes and trying to make them clearer and more precise and to develop them further for quite a while to come. So I'm looking forward very much to engaging with you and to what comments you may have about things I've said. And I want to thank you again for inviting me, and to say how much I wish that we could all get together and have a long and happy discussion, followed by a celebration. But thank you again, and that is my final thought. Thank you.